Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in Chicago history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. The locations and times of day or night that these recorded accounts reach are of interest to us. In 1899, Chicago's skyline was rising ever higher into the clouds, a testament to modernism and development. After the World's Fair, the city was changed not only by its innovative design, but also by a sense of pride that verged on hubris. During this period, the mystery surrounding Mercy Hospital, which was located on the border of Prairie Avenue, would be buried for decades in dusty archives. When orderly Thomas Harkins showed in for his morning shift on a particularly chilly November 1899 morning, it was the first sign that something was wrong. Normally locked with a strong padlock, the basement access door was open. What could have been written off as negligence instead set off a series of events that would reveal a sinister side to the hospital's honorable front. "I noticed it right away," Harkins would subsequently confirm to the Chicago Tribune. "That door was never left open, not once in my 15 years." Harkins would never fully publish what he discovered after descending those stairs. The publication would only mention that authorities had been told of certain disturbing nature finds that had been made in the hospital basement. The Chicago Police Department's Detective James Morrison filed the official report, which was far more thorough but would also be lost to public records by 1907. The remnants of Morrison's notebooks, which were found in 1962 when renovating the old police archives, indicate that the basement housed a very sophisticated laboratory setup that was not allowed by hospital management and was not known to the workers. Not only was the finding unapproved, but it was also extremely well planned, which added to its unsettling aspects. The walls were lined with shelves containing glass jars, each meticulously labeled with strange notations and dates. On a desk, a leather-bound journal with handwritten notes from over 3 years was discovered. Evidently operating since at least 1896, the laboratory was concealed behind a fake wall in the hospital's coal storage chamber. Its existence served as the initial piece of a puzzle that would ultimately lead to Dr. Harrison Powell, a renowned surgeon who had gained recognition from the medical community for his groundbreaking vascular surgical techniques. Powell had come to Mercy Hospital in 1895 with a reputation for genius that verged on eccentricity and strong credentials from Johns Hopkins. He was distant but brilliant, according to his colleagues, a guy whose commitment to furthering medical knowledge seemed to absorb him completely. He was not the sort of man one got close to. Nurse Margaret Sullivan remembered in a 1948 taped interview that was found in the Chicago Historical Society's archives. "There was something in his eyes, a kind of intensity that made you want to look away. But his hands, I've never seen a surgeon with steadier hands." The first probe did not reveal what those calm hands had been doing in the hidden laboratory. The journal was hard to interpret because it was written in a strange cipher and medical terminology. Experiments to preserve human tissue beyond typical biological restrictions were suggested by what might be comprehended. The day after the laboratory was found, Dr. Powell disappeared, never coming back to his Michigan Avenue residence and skipping his morning rounds. Few personal belongings were found during a search of his home, but there was a sizable medical library there, including multiple books on experimental methods that the medical establishment had rejected. Dr. William Farnsworth, the hospital's director, ordered the laboratory to be sealed, claiming he was unaware of Powell's illegal operations. In his formal evidence, Farnsworth said, Dr. Powell had requested that additional research space, but nothing of this nature was ever approved or discussed. If it weren't for what workers discovered when they were clearing out the equipment from the secret laboratory, the investigation might have come to an end there, a gifted doctor gone awry conducting unconventional research. Another door, narrower than usual and sealed with a peculiar locking mechanism, lay behind one of the hefty cabinets. There was no official record of what was behind the second door. The case file was stamped classified by order of Commissioner Frederick Harper. Detective Morrison's notes merely stated that he had requested immediate support from the department and sealing of the porting premises. Within 3 months, the Mercy Hospital basement was fully repaired. If it weren't for doctoral student Elizabeth Kane's accidental discovery in 1962, the narrative might have stayed completely forgotten. During her PhD dissertation research on the history of Chicago's hospitals, Kane discovered a set of financial documents that revealed odd supply orders that Dr. Powell had approved in the years before his laboratory was discovered. The quantities made no sense for normal hospital operations, Kane noted in her notes. Chemicals used in tissue preservation, electrical equipment that would have been cutting edge for the time, and specialized glass containers imported from Germany. All ordered through hospital accounts but diverted somewhere before reaching the main supply room. When Kane started to experience what she characterized as surveillance and unexplainable interference, her investigation took an unexpected turn. Although nothing was taken, her flat was broken into. Her academic advisor abruptly disapproved of the research direction and recommended a subject with easier-to-find documentation. The letter Kane received, postmarked from an unidentified location, with merely a page torn from what looked to be Powell's journal, was the most telling. The conventional boundaries of life and death are not walls, but rather permeable membranes. What we consider the cessation of life is merely the beginning of transformation. I have glimpsed beyond that threshold and seen that consciousness persists, changed but undimmed. My work will prove that what we call death is merely a door, and I have found the key. This was the only paragraph on the page, written in plain English instead of the cipher used throughout the rest of the text. Shortly after receiving the letter, Kane stopped her investigation. She eventually finished her dissertation on a new topic, and after earning her degree, she completely quit academia. In 1968, when a journalist approached her about her previous studies, she simply said, "Some doors should remain closed." Robert Darnan, a journalist for the now-defunct Chicago Sentinel, was interested by Kane's hesitation and started looking into it himself. Darnan took a more straightforward approach, looking for Mercy Hospital staff members who may have worked under Powell. Wilson Hayes, a maintenance worker who had worked at the hospital from 1893 to 1902, was finally found by Darnan. Although the majority had either died or denied any recall of anything out of the ordinary. At first, Hayes, who was in his 92nds and living in an Evanston care facility, appeared perplexed when asked about Dr. Powell. However, as the discussion went on, his attitude shifted. Hayes stated, "I remember him in the Darnan interview that was recorded. Always polite. Always had a nod for everyone, even the likes of me. But there were times when he'd come up from below and his face would be different somehow, like he wasn't seeing what was in front of him, but something else entirely." Although he had presumed that Powell's usage of the basement was authorized by the administration, Hayes acknowledged that he had been aware of it. "He asked me once how to improve the electrical wiring down there without going through official channels. Offered me good money to help. I did it. Times were hard and the doctor paid well." The main body of Darnan's unpublished article would be what Hayes went on to describe. Hayes claimed that the odd noises that occasionally came from the basement were not mechanical, as he had first thought. Hayes spoke the words, "It was like nothing I'd ever heard before." As his voice faded to a whisper on the tape, "Not quite a human sound, but not like any animal either. A kind of humming, but with words almost formed in it. I mentioned it once to Dr. Powell, and the look he gave me. I never brought it up again." Hayes also confirmed that Powell's behavior had become more unpredictable in the weeks leading up to the laboratory's discovery. He stopped sleeping, as far as any of us could tell. Would be there late at night, early morning, and he started talking to himself, or at least that's what it seemed like, walking down hallways, muttering responses to questions nobody had asked. When the nursing home's management abruptly denied Hayes access, citing health concerns, Darnan's inquiry came to a standstill. A week later, when Darnan came back, he was told Hayes was dead. Darnan's efforts to get the death certificate were turned down, and no cause of death was given. Darnan wrote an article, but it was never published. The Sentinel's editor thought it was excessively speculation-filled and possibly defamatory of Mercy Hospital, which by that time was one of the city's most prominent hospitals. Soon after, Darnan left the paper, and his recordings and notes were thought to be lost until his death in 1976, when a collection of his personal belongings was given to the Chicago Historical Society. Among these was a sealed envelope with the inscription, Powell case, not for publication. Inside was a transcription of what Darnan could not specify how he had gotten, but which looked to be many pages from Powell's journal. Powell became increasingly fixated with what he called persistent consciousness, the idea that human awareness could exist apart from biological function, according to the pages that were transcribed. He attempted to quantify electrical activity in neural tissue after death in his early tests, but his notes revealed irritation with the equipment's limits. Powell had progressed from observation to active experimentation by 1897, as the transcription indicates. Stimulation of preserved neural pathways produces measurable response. Tissue viability extended to 72 hours post-mortem through modified preservation solution formula refined from F.A.'s earlier work. Localized electrical stimulation appears to reactivate specific memory centers. The entry with the most upsetting title, dated June 1899, Success Achieved. Full consciousness restoration in isolated neural network. Subject recognized and responded to verbal stimuli. Duration of response: 17 minutes before degradation began. Must refine preservation technique for longer viability. The marginal remarks in later entries, more than the core of Powell's research, which he rejected as scientifically impossible, were what most disturbed Darnan. Darnan's final note on the transcription asked whether Powell had started experimenting on himself, possibly introducing some sort of electrical stimulation to his own neural system. Among these were observations that appeared to have been written by Powell about himself in the third person. Subject displays increased sensitivity to light and sound following procedure. Episodes of disassociation more frequent. Voices persist after electrical stimulation ceases. Neither publication nor additional investigation of this conjecture ever occurred. If it weren't for the 1968 demolition of the former Mercy Hospital building to create room for a new medical facility, the case might have been completely forgotten once Darnan left media. Parts of the original basement had been sealed off rather than renovated during the 1900 construction crews found during preliminary work. The odd sealed compartment was highlighted by Frank Merritt, the demolition supervisor, in his report. No access points visible. Recommendation: specialized removal team. Walls substantially thicker than building code would require, reinforced with steel bands and what appears to be lead shielding. Citing a confidentiality agreement with the hospital management, the company hired to do the specialized demolition declined to share specifics about what they discovered. The scheduled destruction was postponed by nearly 7 months, according to city permission records, and the foundation plans for the new building were changed to prevent upsetting parts of the original basement. One photograph, which was anonymously donated to the Chicago Historical Society in 1977 and was discovered in the personal collection of one of the demolition workers, depicts what looks to be a section of the sealed area undergoing demolition. Although the photograph is low resolution, it definitely depicts an entire chamber with shelves that appear to be glass containers lining the walls. A big table with shackles fastened to its sides sits in the middle of the space. The handwritten note that the donor of the photograph included read, "Contents of glass containers removed by men in protective gear." We were told it was chemical waste. I don't believe it was. Attributing the delays to structural problems and environmental concerns typical of structures from that era, the hospital administration has continuously denied any knowledge of any extraordinary findings during the deconstruction. The city's construction department would typically have official documents of the demolition process. However, these are noticeably lacking. 3 former demolition crew members were admitted to various psychiatric facilities in the Chicago area in 1969. Shortly after the demolition was finally finished. They were all diagnosed with what their records called acute paranoid delusions and auditory hallucinations. All 3 had worked directly on the sealed portion of the basement. One of the men claimed hearing voices that seemed to come from inside their heads, but were not their own thoughts, comparing it to listening to a radio station you can't turn off, broadcasting from somewhere far away, according to the few medical records that have been made public. Electroconvulsive therapy, which was then a relatively new method, was part of the intense treatment that all 3 men received. After their symptoms improved, 2 were eventually freed. The third remained in an institution until his death in 1981, although he was just known as Patient M in the records. Although his condition had improved, his final mental evaluation revealed that he still occasionally heard voices using what he characterized as medical terminology from another time. The Powell case's most recent development occurred in 1965, when renovations to an ancient building on South Dearborn Street revealed a secret room that looked to be a doctor's office that had not been used since the turn of the century. According to property records, a Harrison Wilson bought the building in December 1899, not long after Powell vanished from Mercy Hospital. The office included a number of periodicals, a set of glass slides, and period-appropriate medical equipment. The most notable was a picture discovered in a desk drawer depicting a guy who was thought to be Powell standing next to what looked to be an early electroencephalograph, a tool for detecting brain activity that wouldn't be developed in its current form until 1924. The office's journals were mostly unreadable due to severe moisture damage. The final legible entry, undated but estimated to be from around 1905 based on surrounding material, read, "The mechanism is not electrical, but something more fundamental. Consciousness exists as a field rather than a product of neural activity. The field can be manipulated, redirected, even transferred under proper conditions. What could be deciphered suggested continuing research along the lines started in the hospital basement, but with a shift in focus from what Powell described as consciousness transfer protocols. My earlier work was fundamentally misguided. I was preserving the vehicle while the passenger had already departed. Now I understand how to call the passenger back or to send myself forward. Tonight, I attempt the final procedure." What happened to Harrison Wilson, divided by Harrison Powell after this entry, is not documented. In Cook County, neither name was ever used to file a death certificate. In 1912, the Dearborn Street building's ownership changed, and tax records showed it as abandoned property. The 1967 discovery of a number of medical articles published in obscure European journals between 1901 and 1908 is what makes the Powell case so unique. The papers, written by a Dr. H. Wilson, described experimental methods for preserving neural tissue that were decades in advance of their time. Although the scientific world of the time mostly disregarded the articles, they have now been acknowledged for foreshadowing a number of important ideas in contemporary neuroscience. A 1968 linguistic examination by Dr. Alan Thorndike of Northwestern University provided the strongest connection between these papers and Powell. Thorndike contrasted the Wilson article's writing style with well-known Mercy Hospital medical record samples of Powell's. Thorndike's paper was never formally published. Colleagues claim that he withdrew it from consideration after receiving what he described as concerning correspondence about his research. His conclusion, published in a limited circulation academic paper, was that the probability of these texts being authored by different individuals is statistically negligible. Soon after, Thorndike took a sabbatical and returned to Northwestern, where he concentrated on completely different projects. During the 1968 dismantling of Mercy Hospital, another unsettling discovery was made in the walled basement. Workers discovered a network of small tunnels that extended outside from the main laboratory area, according to private notes taken by site manager Joseph Brennan. They looked to have been hand-dug and led to a number of places, including what would have been right beneath the hospital's operating rooms and morgue. They were about 4 feet in diameter. According to Brennan's notes, which were never formally filed but were shared with a colleague at another construction company, the tunnels were lined with an odd metallic mesh that engineers couldn't identify. His account of what seemed to be some sort of communication gear positioned periodically throughout the tunnels, rudimentary speakers and microphones attached to wiring that spanned the length of the passages, was even more unsettling. Brennan's notes ended abruptly after this observation. His employer's records show that the next day he requested reassignment to a different project, citing personal concerns about site conditions. The implication, Brennan wrote, is that whatever was happening in that laboratory was connected to other areas of the hospital, and someone or something was communicating between these locations. He never went back to the Mercy Hospital site after his request was approved. Edith Parsons, an old woman, approached the Chicago Historical Society in 1969, claiming to have information regarding Dr. Powell. Parsons consented to a taped interview, but demanded that it not be released until after her passing. She described herself as a former nurse who had worked at Mercy from 1897 to 1902. She recounted seeing Powell in the hospital operating room late at night, long after his planned surgeries had ended, in the recording, which was finally made available to the Society's archives in 1978 after Parsons' death. Parsons claimed that Powell occasionally operated on patients who weren't on the hospital's official registration. They would arrive after midnight, Parsons said on the tape, brought in through the service entrance. No paperwork, no records. Dr. Powell would attend to them personally, with minimal assistance, usually just Mr. Finch, the night orderly who was devoted to the doctor. They would be taken to Operating Theater 3, the smallest one, furthest from the wards. According to Parsons, the treatments would frequently continue until daybreak, at which point the patients would be transferred to a dedicated recuperation facility in a remote region of the hospital's East Wing. And the sounds that sometimes came from that room. They were kept separate from other patients. No visitors were allowed, and they never seemed to fully recover. Just stared at the walls, occasionally mumbling words that made no sense. After a few weeks, they would disappear. We were told they had been transferred to specialized care facilities, but no transfer paperwork was ever processed. Parsons' account of Powell's behavior throughout these surgeries was the most unsettling. He would talk continuously, but not to his assistant or the patient. It was as if he was reporting his observations to someone else, someone who wasn't in the room. He would pause, as if listening to responses, then continue with his work. Sometimes he would argue with this unseen presence, becoming quite agitated. The last such procedure I witnessed, in October 1899. He became so distressed that he threw a surgical instrument across the room, shouting, "I cannot maintain the connection if you continue to interfere." When Powell's laboratory was found in November 1899, Parsons expected to be questioned by authorities, but was told she was being moved to another facility right away. Parsons said she had brought these concerns to the attention of hospital director Farnsworth, who dismissed them and cautioned her against spreading hysterical rumors. It was made very clear to me that discussing what I had seen would result in the termination of my nursing career, she said on the Steri tape. According to historical records, Edith Parsons was employed at Mercy Hospital during the relevant time period before being moved to St. Luke's Hospital in November 1899. The veracity of her allegations on Powell's unlawful practices, however, cannot be confirmed. On the location of the former Mercy Hospital, the new medical complex was finished in 1970. A specialized research section of the facility, now known as Lakeside Medical Center, was supported by a private foundation whose board of directors comprised 2 former hospital managers and numerous well-known doctors. The research carried out in this wing was centered on tissue preservation methods and advanced neurological examinations, based on the few public documentation that is currently available. With distinct security systems and limited entry points, access to this research wing was strictly regulated. In 1977, a former employee, identified only as a former laboratory technician, told the Chicago Tribune that the research wing contained historical medical specimens of significant scientific value kept in specialized containment units, and that personnel were required to sign unusually comprehensive confidentiality agreements that basically forbid you from discussing anything you see or do there for the rest of your life. In response to questions about the specimens, the technician said that they were unlike anything I had encountered in my medical training, and that he had troubling dreams after dealing with them, which ultimately prompted him to quit his job. After around 7 years of operation, the research wing was abruptly shuttered in 1977. Officially, the closure was justified by reorganization of research priorities, but there were whispers in the medical community that there had been some sort of incident that drove the closure. The wing remained locked, with its contents likely taken to another site, and no information about this purported occurrence was ever made public. The night staff at Lakeside Medical Center reported a number of strange occurrences in 1978, Maintenance checks found no technical problems that could account for these incidents, which included equipment failures, mysterious power fluctuations, and what some nurses referred to as voices coming through the intercom system when no one was using it. Concerningly, a number of patients on the neurology unit reported that they were visited overnight by a non-staff physician. Although the stories differed, they all described a tall, skinny man with keen eyes who questioned them in an odd way about their consciousness and whether they had felt separated during their operations. These accounts were rejected by the hospital management as the product of drug side effects or dreamlike states that are typical during the healing process following surgery. Internal memos found during a subsequent administrative inquiry, however, showed that a unique reporting system was set up for anomalous patient encounters and that security procedures were subtly improved, especially at night. When the hospital's electrical system was being renovated in 1979, workmen found a secret room next to the former research wing. There was only one object in the room, a glass case that held what looked to be an old medical instrument. The apparatus, which looked like a cross between an early electroencephalograph and a radio transmitter, had a little plate with the initials HP engraved on it connected to the base, but no manufacturer's mark. Before the restoration crew could adequately document or analyze the item, hospital security took it away. Hospital management denied any knowledge of such a discovery when questioned afterward. But before the device was taken out, one of the electricians was able to snap a picture of it. The device appeared to have been used lately, as seen by the photos that quickly passed among workers before being confiscated. Its dials were set to certain places, and what appeared to be new connecting wires stretched from its main casing. In 1962, Elizabeth Kane discovered a fascinating fact about Powell's early career when investigating his background for her dissertation. Powell had temporarily studied under Dr. Friedrich Gultz, a physiologist famous for his contentious research on canine brain localization, in Strasbourg prior to his job at Johns Hopkins. Gultz's research challenged accepted notions about the location of brain activities by showing that dogs may survive the removal of large sections of their brains while maintaining some essential functions. A brief 1,893 communication between Powell and Gultz that Kane found particularly intriguing mentioned tests that went beyond Gultz's published findings. Your demonstrations of functional persistence after extensive cortical removal suggest possibilities far beyond what you have publicly proposed. If consciousness is not localized but distributed, might it not exist independently of the physical structure entirely? Might it not be captured, preserved, or even transferred? Powell wrote in a letter that is preserved in the Johns Hopkins archives. Gultz's response was cautious but not dismissive. Your theories extend well beyond experimental evidence. However, I have observed certain phenomena in my subjects that defy conventional explanation. We should discuss these matters in person rather than in correspondence. No record indicates that such a meeting ever occurred, but Powell's later research indicates that he continued to explore these ideas long after leaving Strasbourg. A strange incident happened at the medical library at Northwestern University in 1974. In 1952, an anonymous philanthropist sent the institution a collection of rare medical texts, which a doctoral student studying the history of neurosurgery requested access to. One of these texts was a handwritten manuscript called Observations on Neural Persistence and Consciousness Transfer, which was solely credited to H.W. The student was allowed access to the planned collection, but 30 minutes later, they reported that the manuscript was nowhere to be found. The text was declared misplaced in the catalog after a search of the library was unsuccessful. Alexander Parker, the student, was discovered unconscious in his apartment by his roommate 3 days later. After being taken to the hospital, he spent about a week in a coma. Parker reportedly left the program soon after and moved to Alaska, cutting off communication with former faculty and colleagues. When he regained consciousness, he complained of ongoing headaches and auditory disturbances that he described as voices discussing medical procedures. Parker had no recollection of how he got into that state. The entire collection was eventually transferred to the university's restricted archives, which are only accessible with special permission from the Board of Trustees. The manuscript he had tried to access was never found. During the initial examination of the sealed sections in the basement of Mercy Hospital in 1967, a peculiar finding was uncovered that was never documented in official documents. Workers discovered what looked to be a crude recording system connected to different areas of the hospital via a system of pneumatic tubes and wires, according to handwritten notes discovered among demolition supervisor Frank Merritt's personal belongings following his death in 1982. Merritt referred to the system as a mechanical eavesdropping device of remarkable sophistication for its era, and it seemed to be able to record and capture noises from various spots across the hospital. Merritt found it particularly unsettling that a number of the gathering sites were situated in the morgue, surgical rooms, and patient rooms in the terminal care ward. The implication, Merritt wrote, is that Powell was systematically recording the sounds of patients in various states, from conscious to anesthetized to terminal to deceased. The purpose of such recordings is difficult to imagine unless one considers his reported obsession with consciousness and its persistence beyond bodily function. The specialized team brought in to clear the sealed areas removed. The recording equipment, which included wax cylinders similar to early phonograph records. Merritt's notes indicate that he was able to hear one of the cylinders for a brief moment before it was seized. Shortly after this experience, Merritt requested reassignment, citing health concerns, describing what he heard as a cacophony of voices, some clearly in distress, others speaking in tones and cadences that seemed inhuman. Neither fully formed words nor animal sounds, but something in between. In the weeks after working at Mercy Hospital, Merritt complained of recurrent auditory hallucinations and insomnia. According to his own physician's records, which were eventually included in an investigation into worker safety at the demolition site, an interesting paper emerged in a little-known neurological magazine published in Vienna in 1959, long before Elizabeth Kane's research brought the Powell case back into the spotlight. The author of the paper, Consciousness as Wave Function, Theoretical Model for Non-Localized Awareness, is Dr. Anton Schreiber, a neurologist who founded a modest private practice in Chicago after escaping Germany during World War II. The paper put up the novel hypothesis that human consciousness could be a kind of wave function that just interacts with the brain instead of being produced by it. The page includes multiple references to experimental data that appear to corroborate this concept, despite the fact that it is mainly disregarded by the mainstream scientific community. This article is especially pertinent to the Powell case because Schreiber's practice was housed in a building that was owned by the same private foundation that later provided funding for the specialized research wing at Lakeside Medical Center, less than 2 blocks from the location of the former Mercy Hospital. Even more curious is the fact that Schreiber left his practice and left no forwarding address when he vanished without explanation in 1961. Within days after his disappearance, his flat was emptied out, and Foundation staff confiscated his patient data, alleging confidentiality issues. A slender, intense-looking man is seen standing next to an odd piece of medical equipment at Schreiber's office in a single photograph that was discovered in the archives of a local German-language newspaper that had written a profile of him in 1957. The contraption, which doesn't look like any typical medical instrument from the time, is remarkably similar to the one in the photo found in the secret office on Dearborn Street, which is thought to depict Harrison Powell using an early electroencephalograph. A time capsule was found lodged in the cornerstone of the original Mercy Hospital in 1968 during the last stages of the building's deconstruction. The predicted contents of the capsule, which was deposited there while the hospital was being built in 1873, included newspapers, pictures, a list of the hospital's original board members, and other documents pertaining to its creation. Unexpectedly, a second, smaller capsule was found concealed underneath the first. There were just 2 objects in this second container, which appeared to have been added much later. A glass vial that contained what looked to be a preserved tissue sample, and a small leather-bound diary that was devoid of any identifying markers. According to demolition records, a hospital administration person promptly claimed the diary and had it taken from the location. As would have been the case with any potentially dangerous historical material, the vial was sent to a laboratory for study, but the results were never submitted to the city. The tissue sample seemed to be neural tissue of some kind, preserved in a solution he could not identify, according to one of the laboratory technicians who examined the vial initially. More concerningly, he noted that the tissue seemed to respond to electrical stimulation in a way that should have been impossible given its age and presumed non-viability. Shortly after reporting this, the technician was transferred to another department, and the vial vanished from the laboratory's inventory without explanation. In 1982, the electrical system at Lakeside Medical Center saw a number of anomalous power fluctuations. Utility company engineers were unable to pinpoint a precise cause for the irregularities, but they were able to trace them back to the hospital. There was a clear pattern to the oscillations, which mostly happened between 2 in the morning and 4 a.m., and included power spikes instead of blackouts, as though the hospital was often using enormous quantities of electricity. Internal maintenance records eventually acquired through a Freedom of Information Act request revealed that no such testing was planned or approved during the relevant dates. Despite the hospital administration attributing the phenomena to testing of new medical equipment, the notes in the security logs for those same periods were more worrisome. There were atmospheric disturbances in some parts of the hospital, especially around the permanently sealed research section, according to guards. The power fluctuations stopped abruptly in September 1982, when neurologist Dr. Rebecca Chen, whose research at Lakeside had focused on consciousness studies in comatose patients, vanished. These disruptions included inexplicable temperature drops, static electricity effects, and what one guard described as a visible wavering of the air, like heat rising from pavement, but inside a climate-controlled corridor. Thomas Reiner, a medical student at the University of Chicago, started having what he called intrusive thoughts in 1964 while researching the history of neurology. These ideas, which he first ascribed to stress and overwork, manifested as in-depth technical understanding of neuronal preservation methods that much exceeded the scope of his education. In a private journal, Reiner started recording these episodes, describing how the information frequently came to him in a voice not my own. Speaking directly into my mind, the voice gave him detailed instructions on how to build apparatus that was supposed to measure and record what it called consciousness waves, which it claimed existed, independently of the physical brain. A psychiatrist who was worried about Reiner's mental health determined that he had stress-induced psychosis and suggested that he take a break from his studies. Nevertheless, prior to starting treatment, Reiner discovered something unsettling. Some of the technical details that had been revealed to him during these episodes matched exactly with excerpts from Powell's research journals, which were unpublished documents that Reiner could not have accessed. I understand now. I'm not generating these thoughts. I'm receiving them. Something is using my mind as a conduit, trying to continue work that was interrupted decades ago. It knows I have the knowledge to understand, the skills to implement. It's been searching for someone like me, and now it's found me. God help me, but part of me wants to know more. This was the most alarming entry in Reiner's final journal, dated the 15th of March, 1964. Reiner vanished 3 days after writing this entry. According to university records, he just ceased going to classes rather than formally withdrawing. There was no sign of his whereabouts or plans, and his apartment was discovered untouched. After weeks without any leads, Chicago police classified the case as a voluntary disappearance after conducting a cursory investigation. In an odd epilogue, a T.R. Wilson without any institutional affiliation wrote an article on brain persistence that was published in a small scientific magazine in 1966. The experimental methods reported in the publication were very similar to those credited to Powell in his recovered notes and to those documented in Reiner's private notebook. Shortly after that issue, the journal stopped publishing, and T.R. published no more papers. Wilson was mentioned in scientific publications at some point. One of the most unsettling instances of scientific research free from moral restraints is the Powell case. It seems that what started off as valid research on how the brain works has turned into something far darker. Studies that went beyond the bounds of human comprehension, as well as the medical ethics of Powell's time. According to the disjointed evidence, Powell might have made a significant discovery regarding the nature of consciousness that, even by today's standards, defied accepted scientific knowledge. But because of a fixation that finally drove him into darkness, He pursued this finding in secret rather than disclosing it through the appropriate channels. Perhaps the most concerning aspect of the case is not what is known, but rather what is still unknown. An ongoing attempt to contain whatever Powell unleashed, rather than to deny or disprove it, is suggested by the pattern of interference with investigations, the disappearance of records and researchers, and the sealed spaces that have remained undisturbed despite decades of renovation and reconstruction. People who have gone too near the truth have frequently been sidetracked, disheartened, or in more unsettling situations, have completely vanished. The pattern reflects an active containment protocol for something that is still a current problem rather than the protection of an embarrassing historical secret. The Powell case is largely an urban legend, a ghost story given to new hires during night shifts, according to those who work at what is now Lakeside Memorial Medical Center. The established facts, the walled spaces beneath their feet, the missing researchers are little known, and maybe that ignorance serves as a kind of defense. You have a lower chance of finding what you don't look for. Nevertheless, sometimes something eludes the meticulously guarded curtain of secrecy. A patient who reports seeing a doctor who doesn't exist, a piece of equipment that turns on without being turned on, or a voice on an intercom from a purported empty room. These instances are obediently reported, stored, and dealt with according to procedures set up by managers decades ago who never gave a reason for them. A recurring electrical issue in a little utilized storage space next to the former research wing was fixed in 1991 by Carlos Jimenez, a maintenance worker. His later report states that he found a peculiar junction box hidden in the wall behind a false panel. In contrast to the hospital's official electrical designs, the box seemed to be connected to an independent power system. Jimenez tried to follow the connections and discovered that they led into a wall portion that should have been solid concrete based on the architectural blueprints. Upon closer examination, it was discovered that the wall had a small opening between Mercy Hospital's original foundation and Lakeside Medical Center's more recent building. Jimenez told his boss what he had seen, and he was told to close the wall and not bring up the disparity again. Jimenez was transferred to a different hospital facility after he insisted on submitting a formal report citing possible safety issues. Without any additional research, his written report was considered a non-actionable maintenance anomaly and archived. Jimenez started having bad headaches and hearing problems 3 weeks later. According to hospital records, he was evaluated at Lakeside's neurology department after being admitted. There, scans showed abnormal activity in the brain's parietal and temporal lobes, which are involved in sensory integration and auditory processing. In his records, the attending physician, Dr. Sofia Reyes, recorded that Jimenez claimed to have heard voices talking about medical procedures and that he occasionally spoke in an official, antiquated style that was different from his typical speech patterns. Dr. Reyes referred Jimenez for psychiatric evaluation, but before this could happen, he checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice. What was more worrisome was his insistence that he was getting instructions for building a device that would allow fuller manifestation of the consciousness field. Personnel records show that he never picked up his last salary and never returned to his job at Lakeside. After numerous attempts to reach him at his home address, he was finally classified as having voluntarily terminated employment. 6 months after this incident, Dr. Reyes herself took an unannounced leave of absence, which was a troubling epilogue. Her request was sent to the hospital administration, stating that she had personal health concerns requiring immediate attention. She never came back to work. And co-workers who tried to get in touch with her said that her apartment had been left and her phone disconnected. 3 years later, Reyes's only correspondence turned up. A postcard addressed to a former co-worker postmarked from a small New Mexico town with the cryptic words, "Some questions shouldn't be asked. Some doors shouldn't be opened. He found me through my interest in the case. Now I can't get him out of my mind." During a symposium held at Lakeside Medical Center in 1996, Dr. Martin Keller, a visiting neurologist from Johns Hopkins, showed an interest in the facility's past. Keller specifically asked about the shuttered research wing and the stories of strange experiments carried out there in the 1,970 seconds during a tour of the site. Keller persisted, pointing out that he had found references to the research in the personal documents of a former colleague from Johns Hopkins who had briefly consulted at Lakeside in 1975. Despite the hospital administrator leading the tour, dismissing these questions as based on urban tales, the administrator quickly ended the tour and had another guide show him the rest of the facility, according to Keller's later story, which he gave to a journalist on condition of anonymity. That night, in his hotel room, Keller got a call from a man who described himself only as a representative of the hospital's historical committee. He offered to meet with Keller in private to talk about the hospital's history off the end record. Keller accepted the intrusion, and the meeting was held the next morning in the hotel's restaurant. According to Keller, the man, who was characterized as an elderly man with unusually intense eyes, had worked at Mercy Hospital in its last years and was aware of the research that was being done there. According to him, the endeavor had included sophisticated research on neural persistence and had yielded findings that were challenging to reconcile with accepted scientific knowledge. Keller described feeling more uneasy as the conversation went on, noting that the man appeared to have in-depth knowledge of Keller's own research and consciousness studies, even though this information was not publicly available. The man became evasive when Keller pressed for specifics, stating only that the research had opened doors that proved difficult to close, and that continuing the work was deemed inadvisable for multiple reasons. He advised Keller to direct his scholarly interests elsewhere, cautioning that those who delved too deeply into the Powell case often found themselves drawn into matters beyond their understanding or control. In what Keller saw as a covert warning, the meeting concluded with the words, "Consciousness is not what we think it is, Dr. Keller. It does not begin or end where we believe, and some consciousnesses, once awakened to certain possibilities, never truly sleep again." Keller left Chicago right away following this encounter, shortening his intended stay at the conference. He shifted his study focus to neurodegenerative disorders, which is completely unrelated to consciousness studies, after returning to Johns Hopkins. A writer looking into the Powell case contacted Keller in 2001, but Keller declined to go into any detail, claiming that his shift in research focus had been a personal choice based on evolving scientific interests and unaffected by outside forces. The Lakeside Medical Center's administrative record storage facility caught fire in 2001. A large amount of the historical records pertaining to the building's construction and early operations were destroyed by the fire, which was put out before it spread to other parts of the hospital. The sudden shutdown of the specialized research wing in 1977 and the loss of all its records were particularly noteworthy. The incident had a number of unusual features. According to fire investigators, the fire had started in the exact section that held these particular records. It had happened on a holiday weekend, when the facility was understaffed, and the building's fire suppression system had suffered a localized malfunction that prevented it from activating immediately. In spite of these dubious conditions, the incident was declared unintentional and was ascribed to defective wiring. However, security camera footage from the record storage area had been unavailable due to an unexplained system outage at the precise moment the fire started, according to an internal hospital security department memo that was later leaked to a local journalist. Rebecca Torres of the Chicago Tribune, the journalist who obtained this document, started looking into the incident as part of a larger article about hospital safety procedures. Torres claimed to have encountered bizarre occurrences within weeks of starting her research, including electrical problems in her office and home, odd sounds and clicks on her phone line, and the feeling that she was being watched while she worked on the article. The most unsettling was her statement that she had started having dreams about a tall, thin doctor who inquired about her consciousness and implied that she had a part to play in continuing important work. Torres said she woke up from these dreams with excruciating headaches and felt as though the conversations had been more genuine than typical dreams. After 6 weeks, Torres told her editor she was no longer comfortable with this particular subject and dropped the inquiry. She refused to share her research with colleagues and asked to be moved to a different beat. Torres claimed to have destroyed her investigative notes when another reporter later requested them, stating merely that they included information that should not be shared. The family of Edward Marsh, a patient who had been in for regular gallbladder surgery but experienced what hospital records referred to as an unexpected neurological event during recuperation, filed an unprecedented case against Lakeside Medical Center in 2003. Despite the fact that the surgery had no direct neurological component, the complaint claimed that Marsh had suffered from carelessness and that his personality and cognitive function had changed significantly after the procedure. In contrast to his typical speech habits, Marsh had woken up from anesthesia speaking in what his family characterized as an archaic formal manner, according to court filings. In addition, he had demonstrated a thorough understanding of early 20th century medical practices that he shouldn't have had as a high school history teacher without any medical training. The most troubling was Marsh's insistence that he was not Edward Marsh at all, but rather a practitioner who has been awaiting the opportunity to continue vital research. Marsh had been found drawing intricate diagrams of what looked like complicated electrical equipment, which he claimed would bridge the gap between states of consciousness. According to hospital records, Marsh had been diagnosed with postoperative confusional syndrome and given antipsychotic medication before being moved to the psychiatric ward. His health had not improved after 6 weeks of treatment, so he was transferred to a long-term care institution that specialized in neuropsychiatric illnesses. Both sides signed extensive secrecy agreements as part of an out-of-court settlement for an unknown amount. Marsh continued to be institutionalized, and the care facility's recurring reports showed that neither his illness nor his insistence on his false identity had changed significantly. One of Marsh's attending physicians at Lakeside had wrote in his file, in an odd addendum to the case, that the patient had called him by name prior to a formal introduction and had mentioned personal information about the doctor's life that he could not have known. Prior to being filed during the lawsuit's discovery phase, this note was deleted from Marsh's official medical record. However, a worried nurse saved a duplicate, which she subsequently gave to Marsh's family. According to the nurse, who asked not to be named, similar incidents had happened with other patients over the years, especially those who had had operations in Operating Theater 3, which was located directly above one of the sealed areas of the original Mercy Hospital basement, according to hospital blueprints. Construction workers discovered what looked to be a sealed door behind a section of wall that should have been solid concrete, according to architectural blueprints in 2007, while renovating the east wing of Lakeside Medical Center. With the exception of the initials HP carved on a small plate close to the handle, the massive steel door, which was locked with an odd mechanism, had no distinguishing signs. Workers were moved to other parts of the project and construction in that segment was immediately stopped. A specialist team from a private security company was sent in by hospital administration to inspect the door, and temporary walls with asbestos remediation in progress signs were erected down the entire hallway. Daniel Morrison, one of the construction workers, tried to revisit the sealed area after hours to look into the abrupt change in the project timetable. According to his later report, which he provided to a paranormal research website under a pseudonym, he was able to enter the hallway but discovered that the door and a large section of the wall around it had already been taken down. In its place was what Morrison described as a solid concrete fill, like they'd pumped the entire space full of new material. More disturbing was his claim that while examining the area, he had experienced a strange pressure in my head, like something was trying to communicate directly with my brain, accompanied by what he described as whispered instructions that I couldn't quite make out. Morrison quit the construction project the following day, citing personal reasons. In a follow-up interview with the paranormal website 6 months later, he claimed to be experiencing ongoing symptoms, including severe headaches, auditory hallucinations, and dreams in which he was visited by a doctor who keeps asking me to build something. Hospital administration denied any knowledge of a sealed door being discovered during the renovation, attributing the temporary work stoppage to routine structural assessment and dismissing Morrison's claims as imaginative but entirely fictional. The renovation was completed on schedule, with no further incidents reported. In 2009, neurologist Dr. Amelia Rodriguez wrote a paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies called Persistent Neural Patterns: Evidence for Non-Localized Consciousness. The paper, which drew heavily from research at Lakeside Medical Center's specialized neurology department, put forth a controversial theory regarding consciousness existing as a field phenomenon rather than being solely the result of brain activity. Rodriguez, who had been given extraordinary access to the hospital's 1,970 seconds research archives, provided evidence that some brain patterns might endure longer than the typical period of cellular deterioration, especially under certain electromagnetic settings. The paper caused a great deal of controversy in the scientific community, with many rejecting Rodriguez's theories as speculative and unsupported by mainstream research. Although Rodriguez refrained from making metaphysical claims, she did suggest that the conventional understanding of consciousness as a byproduct of brain function might be fundamentally incomplete, but only a handful of scientists thought her data was strong enough to merit more research. Rodriguez asked for a leave of absence from her job at Lakeside 3 months after the paper was published, citing personal health concerns. According to colleagues, she had grown more paranoid in the weeks before the request, saying that she was being watched by unidentified parties for her research and that she had started having strange dreams and thought patterns. Rodriguez never came back to work at Lakeside. She moved to a distant part of Oregon and opened a tiny private clinic practicing conventional neurology, according to public records. She simply stated that she had reconsidered the ethical implications of her work and decided to pursue less contentious fields of study when colleagues approached her about her prior studies. In confidential emails that came to light after the colleague's passing in 2015, Rodriguez raised additional concerning worries. What I discovered in those archives wasn't just data. It was evidence of something that has been continuing without oversight or constraint for over a century. Powell didn't die in 1899. He just changed form, and he's still working. Still experimenting. Still seeking ways to extend his consciousness beyond its original boundaries. The dreams started after I accessed the sealed records. He found me through my interest, just as he's found others before me. I had to get away, had to break the connection before it became too strong. But sometimes I still hear him, especially at night, whispering about permeable membranes and consciousness fields, and the work that must continue. The Powell case is still unclear as of right now, with no official recognition of its peculiar past or the enduring stories that surround it. Lakeside Memorial Medical Center remains one of Chicago's top medical institutions. Hospital staff turnover in some departments, especially neurology and after-hours maintenance, is still much higher than industry averages. Although administration ascribes this to the demanding nature of the work environment, the original foundation of Mercy Hospital is still mostly intact beneath the current structure, with some areas permanently sealed and marked on maintenance blueprints only as void, do not disturb. Reports of patients being seen by a non-staff physician still happen from time to time, particularly for patients recuperating from neurological treatments, and are obediently stored away in accordance with processes that were put in place decades ago. Although it now focuses more on the preservation of historical medical artifacts than on ongoing research, the private foundation that provided funding for the specialized research wing in the 1,970 seconds is still in place. A number of the members of its board of directors have family ties to the original Mercy Hospital management, ensuring a continuity of supervision spanning over a century. If the majority of Chicagoans are aware of the story of Dr. Harrison Powell and his eerie laboratory, it is at best a little-known historical anecdote. The witnesses have mostly disappeared, the official records are disjointed, and those who are aware of the whole truth are still unable or reluctant to voice it. But every now and then someone gets interested, a journalist looking for a compelling local story, a historian exploring Chicago's past, or a medical student drafting a paper. They start by posing queries, seeking documents, and speaking with previous workers. Eventually, they run against the subtle but tenacious opposition that has surrounded the case for many generations. Unlocatable documents, abruptly inaccessible sources, and their own concentration mysteriously moving to other subjects. Those who persevere in the face of these challenges frequently report bizarre occurrences, such as electrical disruptions, intense dreams, or the feeling that someone else is observing their job. Some people report having thoughts that don't seem to be their own, hearing whispered voices while they're by themselves, or using medical jargon they've never studied or technical ideas they don't fully grasp. Some, the most in-depth and closest to whatever truth is at the core of the Powell case, just vanish, leaving behind incomplete research and worried colleagues who get postcards from far away telling them that everything is okay, even though the handwriting appears to have changed. The case's apparent continuity, rather than its historical oddity, is what is most concerning. The idea that whatever Powell started in 1899 is still going on now in some way. Not as an organization or a research project in the traditional sense, but as something deeper and more unsettling, a consciousness that lingers beyond of its initial bounds and tries to spread farther through the thoughts of those who come into contact with it. Accordingly, the Powell case is not just a historical mystery, but a living phenomenon that continues to influence people's lives, change their perspectives, and sometimes take the lives of those who approach its central riddle too closely. For the night shift workers at Lakeside Memorial Medical Center, the ancient tales about Dr. Powell and his lab are just that. Stories used to terrify new hires or to explain the odd noises that occasionally reverberate through the building's oldest sections. Few people give them much thought, and even fewer relate them to the equipment that turns on without being turned on, the voice that occasionally comes through the intercom system from rooms that should be unoccupied, or the occasional patient who wakes up speaking in an antiquated way. However, for a few people in the hospital's management, those who have access to the sealed documents, those who uphold the traditions set down over the ages, those who supervise the permanent sealing of specific areas following every remodeling, the Powell case exemplifies something very different, a containment operation that has been in place for almost a century, with the sole purpose of limiting and controlling whatever was released in that basement laboratory in 1899, rather than researching or comprehending it. According to Dr. Elizabeth Kane's concluding remarks on the topic, some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again, and what passes through them may never truly leave.